You clicked on this video expecting some sort of comprehensive review of the original Phantasy Star for Master System, which you may or may not get. But first, we have to talk about my old friend, Gary. You see, in many ways, this video is just a big fuck you to Gary, who insisted that Black Onyx was the first true JRPG and that I wasn't a true fan of the genre unless I had played and beaten Black Onyx, presumably with an emulator, because where the hell am I going to get an NEC PC 88? Gary was the type of person that whenever you'd mention a game, he'd say, "Yeah, but old game 24 came first, and I have a copy, and I've beaten it without a guide." And if he actually had a copy of Old Game 24, who really knows? I guess it doesn't really matter at this point. But he wore this ancient computer game knowledge like a badge of honor, likely to make up for his lack of talent anywhere else in life. Gary is a case study in contrarianism, a cautionary tale, if you will. So contrary was Gary that he would do the opposite of what anyone told him, including the media. Gary prided himself on knowing the quote-unquote truth, but his truth was literally just the opposite of whatever the current biggest talking points were in any news media outlet, especially mainstream media. And in this way, he was controlled by the mainstream media just as much as anyone else. He just never stopped to think about it long enough to figure that out. And as a parent, I quickly learned that whenever I tried to get my daughter into something, she'd immediately recoil and retreat into her own things. I tried to get her into Pokemon when she was 5 years old or so, but she wouldn't even watch a full episode before declaring it was boring and then going back to Bubble Guppies or whatever garbage she was into at the time. I now realize that if I had just told my daughter that Pokemon was childish trash for little kids, she probably would have eaten it up. Gary is just like this, except instead of 5 years old, he's 33 years old. So, a long, long time ago, when I told Gary I was playing Dragon Quest 1 on the Nintendo, he told me, "Yeah, but have you played Phantasy Star? It's Sega's RPG for the Master System, and it's much better than Dragon Quest. And I have a copy, and I beat it without a guide." And he actually had that one. I saw it while visiting him one time. Gary was a huge Sega fan, and to this day, I associate rabid Sega fans with know-it-all contrarians. Can't really help it at this point. The other point being that when I finally got around to playing Phantasy Star, based on his enlightened recommendations, he told me, "Cool, but have you played Black Onyx? That's the first true JRPG." And I wanted to tell him, "Well, Gary, have you played Koei's Underground Exploration, a dungeon crawler with party creation and monster fighting released on the PC 8001 that predates Black Onyx by 2 years? Well, have you, Gary?" But I would imagine he'd counter with something like, "Well, yeah, but have you played Akalabath? It's the first true computer RPG released in 1979 on the Apple II." Truly, there is no winning with Gary's. To Gary, it's not really about the games. It's about being cool. It's about knowing something other people don't and having experiences other people don't have. And somehow, that makes him better than other people. It makes him cool. He hoards this experience and this ancient computer game knowledge like a goblin that hoards treasure. Every piece of treasure is a piece of treasure somebody else shouldn't have, and if they happen to have similar treasure, the goblin will just present an even more esoteric treasure and say something like, "Well, you don't have this one, do you?" The treasure is really just a stand-in for self-worth. Just like Gary's ancient computer game knowledge, it's a cudgel to beat people into thinking you have something of value, that you're worthwhile on some level. And this becomes obvious as you get older. The harder you try to convince others of this, the harder you push your knowledge on them, the the more obvious it becomes how desperate you are to appear cool. The harder you try, the more you care, and the more you care, the more vulnerable you appear to others who have already gone through and matured beyond acting like a 12-year-old. This search for pointless knowledge, the proverbial synaptic treasure, it's never ending. And it's never ending because computer games don't bestow worth, well-being, or anything really worth a damn. Computer games are about having fun, Gary, not about validating your self-worth and making everyone around you feel like shit. But I guess you're still waiting for the Phantasy Star review or whatever, and that's fine. But before we can talk about Phantasy Star, we have to talk about 600 other games. So buckle up, because I'm about to pull a Gary. First, we have to talk about the Ultima series. Starting with the lesser-known and spookily named Akalabeth World of Doom, developed by Richard Garriott for the Apple II in 1979. World of Doom serves as the predecessor of Ultima, the first Ultima, evolving into Ultima 1, 2, and 3, and 4, spanning from 1981 to 1988. And Ultima, along with our second series that we'll be talking about here in a moment, is D&D in the digital age. Ultima features a top-down, third-person view with dungeons displayed in first-person, one-point perspective. Second is Wizardry, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord from 1981 for Apple II. With Wizardry 2, 3, 4, and 5 spanning from 1982 to 1988 as well. And Wizardry leans more into text-based gameplay, choosing your actions from a menu, and a hallmark of the series, the creation of characters, your entire party really, based on various Dungeons & Dragons tropes. And if you'd allow me to invoke Gary for a moment, these Dungeons & Dragons tropes are actually just stuff stolen from Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings itself being just a ripoff of Norse mythology, particularly drawing inspiration from the 13th century epic, the Volsunga Saga, which outlines the rise and fall of the Volsung clan, and numerous other legends featuring Nordic giants, trolls, dwarves, and elves, amalgamating elements from Celtic and Norse mythology. Okay, I'm disabling Gary mode for just a moment. The first Wizardry is a black and white, one-point perspective dungeon crawler that created the genre that we now know of, for better or worse, by the name Blobber. And Blobber stands as a relatively niche genre term that, due to its just ugly-sounding cadence, now primarily only finds usage on RPGcodex.net. A right-leaning RPG forum that is just Gary's all the way down. A place where Gary thinks it's peak humor to reply to threads with just the N-word and LOL, and they haven't actually enjoyed a computer game since BioWare released Baldur's Gate 2 in 2000. Blobber refers to any first-person party-based RPG in which the controlled characters are just amorphously there, like the air itself, and invisible but ever present, like Catholic guilt. Blob refers to the idea that the entity that you control, the thing moving through the environments, the wireframes, is really just some sort of invisible blob with arms and legs, like some sort of Lovecraftian nightmare just munching through goblins and bandits so numbers go up, kind of like a D&D Galactus. So we've talked about CRPGs, but that's not really the beginning of JRPGs. The beginning of JRPGs is with a lesser-known title, which we've gone over already in great detail, called The Black Onyx. And this is developed by Bulletproof Software and released for the NEC PC 88. And a second title called Idealized, I think that's how it's pronounced, developed by T&E Soft for the PC 6001. And both of these were developed by Japanese companies, by primarily Japanese teams, and they both came out in 1984. The Black Onyx, as my super contrarian Sega friend says, is the first true JRPG, dude. And I don't know how true that is or how important that distinction actually is, but it helps set the groundwork by being the first Japanese RPG clearly inspired by wizardry, with wireframe blobber dungeon crawling and a fully player-created party. But the importance of Idealized can't be understated either. Idealized features a top-down perspective that's ultimately, pardon the pun, borrowed from Ultima, wherein your character is like a sprite with like a purple helmet and a glistening silver sword and just roams around walking into monsters to kill them, which is really a precursor to more action-oriented role-playing games like, don't kill me, The Legend of Zelda or Ys, where in Ys, the first two at least, you just walk into stuff to do damage, and that's kind of a highlight of Idealized. Dragon Quest, yeah, we're talking about Dragon Quest now, borrowed heavily from both of these titles and was released in May of 1986. That's 7 years after Ultima and 2 years after both Idealized and Black Onyx. And in many ways, Dragon Quest is an alchemical mishmash of Black Onyx and Idealized. It's an experience level-based RPG with random encounters, much like Black Onyx and Wizardry and Ultima, but it also has an overhead perspective, akin to Idealized and Ultima. Dragon Quest takes the pen, paper, dice roll, number crunching randomness of Wizardry, based upon classic tabletop role-playing games, and mixes these with elements from Idealized's overhead perspective, which is really just Ultima's overhead perspective. Instead of walking into pixelated monsters on a map to defeat them, you battle them through actions selected through a menu-based UI wrapped within a charming Dragon Ball aesthetic by the famed Akira Toriyama. Dragon Quest is a 6-hour-long romp with a single character, predetermined leveling path, no customization whatsoever, complete with random encounters and overworld map towns and dungeons, all in a top-down, Ultima-like perspective, made in Japan. It was a highly successful but grindy affair, and truly baby's first Japanese role-playing game. Dragon Quest was an instant success in Japan. And with that, the true JRPG genre was born. Or something. Of course, the true definition of JRPG is really unknowable and forbidden by mortals. It's hidden only in the minds of long-dead ancient yokai who can only be conjured by burning tanuki statues and a full bottle of Edo period sake, a Japanese copy of The Lord of the Rings, and a fully operational NEC PC-88 in a bonfire during a waning crescent after a rainstorm at 3 in the morning. The true definition of JRPG is irrelevant and ultimately boils down to semantics, like most definitions do. The important bit is that Dragon Quest was a big success and inspired developers all over Japan to copy it. Immediately after Dragon Quest's release, Square started developing Final Fantasy I, which is an improvement on DQ in almost every way, with the addition of player-created characters and a job system, which everybody loves a job system, including myself. The same year, Neon Falco started development of Ancient Ys Vanish, which is the first Ys game, which was more inspired by Idealized than Dragon Quest, but still a worthy contender nonetheless. And as capital dictates business, Sega wanted an RPG on their now year-old Master System. So, having just watched Star Wars Return of the Jedi, Sega designer Kataru Yahashita pitched Phantasy Star, and the legend was born. Released on December 20th, 1987 in Japan, literally 2 days after the release of Final Fantasy I for the Famicom, Phantasy Star emerged as Sega's maiden voyage into the realm of role-playing computer games for their Virgin Master System console, all ready to be deflowered by Star Wars dweebs incited by lightsabers and spaceships. Conceived and pitched by Kotaro Yashida and artist RIEKO Kodama, the latter of which is among one of Japan's first female game developers, who would later go on to direct Phantasy Star 4 and the computer game adaptation of Clamp's Magic Knight Rayearth. She'd also go on to produce acclaimed titles such as Skies of Arcadia and the Seventh Dragon series. Kodama's influence and artistic vision is behind every colorful sprite, every battle scene, and every character, both playable and non-playable in Phantasy Star. She was single-handedly responsible for the majority of the game's art direction and a key influence in the inclusion of a female main character, which was particularly unheard of when it came to Japanese action games of the time. Apparently, Star Wars was one of Kodama's favorite films. The lightsabers, Jedi robe, solar system with multiple planets setting, and the dome-shaped homes found throughout the game are a testament to this Star Wars influence. All of these influences give Phantasy Star a unique and creative edge over its direct competitors, which were, at the time, basically just Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. And while there are many people involved with the creation of the game, people that helped shape it, like composer Tokuhiko Iwabo, which I probably just butchered, and the programmer Yuji Nako, none were as influential on the game's concept and just overall aesthetic as Kodama. And sadly, RIEKO Kodama died on May 9th, 2022, at the age of 58. But that wasn't before leaving behind a legacy of artistic direction for a number of iconic Sega games such as Altered Beast, Alex Kidd, and even the early artwork for Sonic the Hedgehog. Sega's 80s and 90s distinct eye-catching aesthetic would be entirely different without RIEKO Kodama. Her unique style and dedication to her artistic craft made her cool without a hint of posturing or pretension, right until the end. Phantasy Star's setting is best described as science fantasy, with equal parts magic and futuristic technology, taking place within the Algol solar system in the year 342 of the space century, or something. It consists of 3 planets orbiting, presumably some sort of yellow dwarf star, or maybe something much weaker considering how close some of the planets are to their star, according to the game's manual. These 3 planets are Palma, Motavia, and Dezorus. And Palma resembles Earth in some ways. It has dense forests, lakes, rivers, wide open pastures. The inhabitants are known as Palmans, and they also happen to be the characters that we control as, the player. Palmans travel through space using spaceports and starships, and I believe life as we know it in this system, at least intelligent life, started on this planet. To travel in space, however, one needs to get a passport, which is actually as simple as going to the Space DMV and answering their silly question of, have you ever done anything illegal, with a simple, no, I have never done anything illegal. Our second planet is Motavia, and this is a desert planet akin to Tatooine from Star Wars. It even includes Jawas and Sarlacc pits and, of course, extremely high temperatures. And the proximity to Algol's star via its orbit in the manual should theoretically render the planet molten or worse, just completely disintegrated, as per the conventional laws of physics or something. But I suppose Phantasy Star's universe operates under different natural laws. I'd hope. Our final planet, and most likely our last destination in the game itself, is Dezorus. It's an icy tundra with highly vexing tunnel systems that piss me off, inhabited by aliens with elongated faces dubbed evil heads on every other planet. And these evil heads are known for deceit, particularly lying. There's even one town in which half of the town are supposedly liars and the other half are non-liars, and you have to kind of decipher which ones are lying to you and which ones are not. Like, is the lying half actually the truthful one, or vice versa? It's very confusing. On a side note, Algol is a real star system in the Milky Way galaxy composed of three solitary stars, all known as demon stars. And this Algol star system is located in the Perseus constellation and makes up part of Medusa's head, which Perseus happens to be holding. Perseus is actually referenced multiple times in Phantasy Star's plot as the slayer of Medusa, so not only does Phantasy Star reference a real star system in real life, but also Greek mythology. The storyline is akin to something like the original Star Wars trilogy and is fairly straightforward. King Lasik rules the Algol system. He was formerly a benevolent ruler, but something changed in his old age, leading to him closing most of the spaceports, increasing taxes across the galaxy, and implementing numerous draconian laws. The reason behind this sudden benevolence remains unknown. However, when Nero, a spaceport attendant, begins questioning King Lasik's new laws, he is promptly murdered by Lasik's police force, which are interestingly named robot cops. And this kicks off our story. Alice, spelled A-L-I-S, not A-L-I-C-E, serves as our main character and heroine of the story. Her brother happened to be Nero, and his death inspires her to take on the quest to defeat Lasik. And the journey traverses the entire star system. Along the way, she encounters other warriors that are of like-minded value. Odin, a formidable warrior resembling Duke Nukem, who wields axes and guns. And guns are very important in the game because they hit every enemy on the screen, kind of like the boomerang in Dragon Quest. There's a cat creature named Meow, a magical cat, and a proficient wizard named Noah. And Noah is the sole character knowledgeable in the revive magic, and this likens him closest to Jesus Christ in the Phantasy Star universe. A parallel which I think becomes important in later games, maybe. And hailing from 1987, as you can imagine, the game doesn't delve too deeply into the characters' development or personalities. The standout here are the cool character designs by RIEKO Kodama. The distinct cast with their own personalities, regardless of how shallow they may be, is a refreshing change compared to the typical silent protagonist or player-created parties prevalent in games of the same era. Meaning Sega is on the bleeding edge of innovation when it comes to computer games, and, most importantly, the bleeding edge of cool. Those of you who have been keeping up with On Computer Games already know that I hate talking about gameplay mechanics. To shamelessly quote my own essay on Sengoku Rand's titled Radical Empathy, writing about computer game mechanics is like explaining how car engines work in dry detail to someone who hates cars. No one cares unless they want to care, and the people who want to care would be better served experiencing the thing instead of reading 7 paragraphs about it. So, of course, I'm going to keep it brief. First, the graphics. For an 8-bit console from 1985, the Master System is truly an impressive machine capable of pumping out beautiful scenes. Compared to its main competitor, the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the fancily named Famicom in Japan, the Master System has roughly the same power, but could output far more color than the Famicom, which means more vivid scenery, more color shading, and overall more depth. And you can see that in Phantasy Star, because Phantasy Star benefits from all this, and looking like at some points just simply a Super Nintendo or a Sega Mega Drive game instead of a Master System title. The fact that every monster has its own attack animations, sometimes 2 or 3 different attack animations for the different attacks, really adds to the pop of Phantasy Star's visual fidelity and just overall presentation. It's really a great looking game for 1987. The music by Tokihiko Yuabo, who I probably butchered, is just okay. It's somewhat repetitive and it's a bit too shrill for my taste. There are a few standout tracks, however, such as the final dungeon theme with its energetic and anxious energy. Phantasy Star plays very similarly to Dragon Quest. Like we discussed before, instead of just a single character, you have a full party of characters with their own unique kind of pseudo personalities. And of course, this is a departure from its contemporaries, which were either fully player created parties where the characters exist primarily in your own imagination, like Wizardry, Black Onyx, or even Final Fantasy. But other than that, Phantasy Star progresses much like Dragon Quest before it. Almost arcane in its cryptic nature, but more precise than other role playing games or adventure games of the 1980s. Basically, you talk to NPCs in the world, and they make vague mention of directions and key items and places to go to get those key items. And then you kind of have to figure out how to get there by traveling a world map complete with random encounters and vast, sprawling, labyrinthian dungeons. The dungeons themselves are first person, almost one point perspective. And in this way, Phantasy Star is very similar to the original Ultima, which had an overhead perspective outside of the dungeons, but when you went in the dungeons, it was first person. And in this way, Phantasy Star is very Blobber-esque. The dungeons, the walls are always the same. There's no scenery, really. The only thing different is the coloring of the walls, which is kind of a disappointment considering how varied and robust the scenery outside the dungeons can be. There's no map for these dungeons either, meaning you will get lost, often. The original intention of the developers, I suppose, was to map out all of the dungeons yourself on graph paper as you're going through them. Something I actually tried, as you can see here early on, but quickly gave up on this endeavor because I'm just too dumb to line up anything properly on paper. And again, you will get lost. Some of these dungeons are huge, particularly the late game dungeons, which can have up to 10 to 15 floors, all with multiple pathways, many leading to traps that just drop you down a level or two in the dungeon. It's all very hostile to the player, and we are artificially extending the playtime of the game by making you bash your master system with a hammer type of way. A highlight of Phantasy Star's progression, however, is that, unlike Dragon Quest, it's highly non-linear, especially later in the game. This element is taken from kind of the seed-generated games like Aklabeth or the chaotic nature of Wizardry. You can get several items just completely out of order or just miss things completely and still beat the game somehow. Another innovation over Nintendo. Truly, Sega sometimes does what Nintendo don't, as they say. Combat is a standard turn-based affair. Attack, magic, run, and a new addition to the JRPG space, the talk option, which allows you to communicate with monsters. And the talk function doesn't work very often, but it does become better when you learn Noah's telepathy magic. And telepathy allows you to talk to at least dragons with your mind, which is very cool. Talking to monsters usually isn't necessary for progression. They give hints and directions sometimes, while other times they just kind of get mad at you and attack you. The characters themselves progress in a very Dragon Quest fashion as well, with their own predetermined spell lists and equipment that only they can wear. Odin, for example, is the only character who can use guns, which are very helpful, whereas Aelys can only use swords, and because of this, Sega didn't really innovate much here at all. Combat typically devolves into spamming the attack option, except for select cases where you need to use magic. However, you'll typically be conserving magic for bosses at the end of the dungeon. Otherwise, you'll get into a bad situation where you're fighting a boss and won't be able to heal yourself or what have you. There's also select spells like Protect and Wall, which are pretty overpowered. They just completely negate monster attacks, and these spells are very useful for bosses, so you want to make sure you have them available when you fight a dungeon boss. And of course, like other role-playing games from the 80s, grinding is basically mandatory at certain points in the game. Although Phantasy Star is less grindy than its contemporaries, and only requires real hardcore grinding at the very beginning of the game. For example, every playthrough of Phantasy Star starts with at least 3 hours of grinding outside of the first town. And this is entirely unavoidable because everything bodies you except the bees that are named swarms. And you have to grind these swarms, and only swarms, for at least 1 hour so that A-list levels up 3 times, learns heal, and earns at least 75 meseta, the game's currency, to purchase an iron sword from the second town. And after equipping this iron sword, you then need to grind owlbears for another hour until you earn 270 meseta to buy the light suit from the port town, which gives you enough defense and dodge to be able to survive the first dungeon. And in this way, money is the true power in Phantasy Star. Efficiency and damage skyrocket considerably with new and very expensive equipment, and earning enough to buy and equip the iron sword at the beginning of the game is the equivalent of a third world country gaining access to nuclear weapons. The fear quickly dissipates, and suddenly you're bold, posturing, and cutting down all in your path, and forgetting to save often. Speaking of saves, there's multiple save slots, and you can save anywhere, like a built-in save state system. And you'll need this save state system because you'll be throwing away important items on accident, saving in really stupid situations with low HP in a dungeon, and accidentally soft-locking your game. But Sega saw this coming and included multiple save slots as a way to counter the dreaded save state Ouroboros. And finally, when it comes to deciding how to play Phantasy Star, there are a few different versions of the game. There's the original for the Master System, and then there's the updated Sega Ages version, and a version on the Nintendo Switch, which includes the same graphics, but the experience points and money yield is doubled, while the encounter rates are far, far lower. And to top it all off, it has a built-in auto mapper that serves as a real-time digital graph paper that updates automatically as you move through a dungeon. So there's no more getting lost. But getting lost in grinding is kind of part of the true Phantasy Star experience, right? It's cool to play the game as the original creators envisioned it. It's part of history, and you want to be part of this magical history. To truly experience Phantasy Star, you have to play the original without a guide and map the dungeons with graphing paper. You have to take notes of what the NPCs tell you. You have to put up with the slow walking speed and the step-by-step over encounters. You have to grind until your fingers bleed, and if you don't, you haven't really played Phantasy Star, have you? You're not cool unless you play the original on the Master System, and you want to be cool, don't you? Gary Oak from Pokemon got cool in the anime. He dropped his pretensions, but still had this air of edginess about him. Like a mature, self-aware contrarian who knew how to rein it in. Gary Oak became a Pokemon professor, carrying on the legacy of his grandfather before him. But my Gary, however, is now a truck driver, dating another truck driver, and they both alternate driving the same truck so they can get more miles in every week beyond their legal limit. For the record, I have nothing against truck drivers. They keep our country alive. In fact, I've actually considered becoming a truck driver myself, but you can smell this Gary's body odor from 10 feet away, regardless of how much he's washed, due to his heavy consumption of alcohol, which results in copious amounts of sweat oozing from every single one of his pores every minute of the day. He has a greasy mullet accompanied by a balding hair helmet because he hasn't taken off his Make America Great Again trucker hat in 2 years, and he smokes 3 packs of cigarettes a day, putting them out in his Mountain Dew mega gulps, while simultaneously dual-wielding his smartphone at all times to call people the F-slur on the Telegram mobile app, which is the only community he gets social validation from in insane right-wing echo chambers populated primarily by Russian trolls. My Gary still has his gnarly Sega collection. He never fails to remind you of how Sega did it first and how he has all the Sega games. He may be slowly dying from dysentery and emphysema, but he's got his 50-plus Master System games and his ancient computer game knowledge, and that has to be worth something, right? Did Gary's obsession in computer game contrarianism lead him down this self-destructive path? No, not really. I don't think so. Gary was like this about everything from food, music, politics to which car to drive. It wasn't isolated to just computer games. The problem, I think, is that he's not aware of his own contrarianism. He's self obsessed and preoccupied with being cool. And cool to him is someone who is always right about everything, all the time, especially when it comes to sacred, occult computer game wisdom, likely stemming from his early days impressing kids at recess with his cool computer game knowledge on the playground. In elementary school, knowledge about media of any kind was cool, and when you were physically weak, it was especially cool. It was like nerd currency, and with enough dweeb bucks, even the flag football jocks wouldn't beat you up. Even if you had to lie to make it seem like you were more knowledgeable than you actually were, lying in this case facilitated the cool on the playground. Hell, I vaguely remember in 1999 telling kids on the playground that I had special knowledge of new Pokemon before they were ever officially released with Pokemon Gold and Silver a year later. I had this special knowledge because I subscribed to a special computer game magazine that you could only get from Japan. I made up all sorts of dumb Pokemon names like Sheepy and Blueby and Furfriend to impress all the kids at recess. And this made me feel special knowing something others didn't, even if I was just making it the hell up. I didn't even care if they found out I was wrong later on. The immediate gratification, the immediate cool was too satisfying to pass up. I couldn't kick a soccer ball, but I could make up shit about Pokemon and get a smile and a "that's cool" from the kids who had much more going on mentally and physically than myself. It's very cool in elementary school to know all about the secret computer game lore and brag about it every moment you get. It's cool when you're 10, it's not so cool when you're a 33-year-old alcoholic. And my Gary is a 33-year-old alcoholic. He's also a very mean person, always unpleasant to be around, full of anger and sometimes even violence. And he veils all this hatred, vitriol, and contrarianism under the guise of being cool. The four letters stand in for not giving a fuck about the people around you and not even pretending to. It's COOL. It's cool. And what even is cool? Everyone has their own unique version. Sigmund Freud would call it the ego, the part of the mind that balances our desires with reality. Cool is the idealized version of oneself, how you want others to see you, and you'll do pretty much anything to foster and maintain that image, even lie at recess. Cool is why venti exists at Starbucks instead of large, and why Pogs were such a big deal in the 90s, and why Square Enix puts 12 belts on all of their character designs now. Cool is why Aunt Teresa got a Chinese symbol tattooed above her ass and a Celtic symbol she doesn't know the meaning of tattooed on her left foot. Cool is why bell bottoms and Crocs continue to exist. Hell, the entire fashion industry is based on this exploitation of being cool. And you want to be cool, don't you? For Gary, cool is his Sega Master System collection, but also smoking cigarettes and rebelling against society, and sludge metal and borderline unlistenable hardcore music, and the mainstream media always being wrong, and pretending that trucking was truly his dream job all along. That's cool for Gary. For someone else, it might be paying $120 a year to host a website that houses computer game and pop music essays, or posting your favorite songs on social media in hopes somebody might think you have good taste in music, or quoting passages from a book like, "You'll stop worrying what others think about you when you realize how seldom they do." David Foster Wallace, Infinite Jest. All to make others think you're smart and have it all together, or maybe buying a transparent prison CRT television from the 90s to play old computer games on it, or maybe building Gundam models and displaying them in cases because you have cool interests and you want other people to know you have cool interests, or just exclusively playing old computer games to be able to tell people that, yeah, I played that game. I even wrote a review about it, and I made a YouTube video about it called Phantasy Star or Through Being Cool. And that same person might choose to play the original Phantasy Star over the Switch Ages version because the original is the only true way to play Phantasy Star. But they use the fast forward and save state functions on their emulator and also use comprehensive guides with dungeon maps to beat the game. But of course, they wouldn't admit that to you even if they were pressed. They'd use this faux completion of the original Phantasy Star as a badge of honor to anyone unfortunate enough to talk to them about games. Oh no, that's me. I'm Gary. That darkness, the allure of being cool, it's all here in me. And I was never great at music, acting, sports, but I was good at computer games and I know a lot about them. I know a lot about music. I lied at recess. The urge to make sure people know that I know about things is there. The urge to correct people is there. Sometimes I'm just an asshole to my friends for no reason, other than feeling threatened by their knowledge of my interests because I'm supposed to be the expert, not you. I'm Gary. This entire video is just posturing my version of cool to an audience of 16 subscribers and 3 concurrent readers on computer games, and this admittance via this video is just some sort of pathetic post hoc absolution of my own bankrupt character. But at least I'm aware of it, right? I won't really end up like that other Gary, will I? I won't be trading driving duty with my girlfriend and putting cigarettes out in huge empty Mountain Dew mega gulps, calling people ancient but very hateful slurs on Telegram every day. I won't end up like that Gary, will I? But sometimes I do slip. Sometimes I'm selfish and immature, envious and angry, simply over plastic or ones and zeros on a screen. And just the other day, my friend said I was acting like a 16-year-old because I was being extremely cold and distant after saying something extremely rude to him. All because being seen as this idealized, cold, distant, mysterious figure like Morpheus from The Sandman seems capital C, cool. But it's not cool. It's not cool at all. I'm through being cool. So play the Switch version of Phantasy Star. The auto mapping is helpful so you don't get lost. The encounter rate is way lower. The experience yield is much, much higher. It's just a much better Phantasy Star experience overall. And there's nothing cool about wasting hours of your life grinding the same monsters over and over again. There's nothing cool about getting lost in dungeons that all look the same. There's nothing cool about suffering from boredom just for bragging rights online. I'm through being cool, at least for now. I hope.